Hey guys! Tonight we're diving into one of history's most bizarre prejudices, a fear so deeply rooted that it literally shaped our language and left its mark on civilizations for millennia. Picture yourself walking through the bustling streets of ancient Rome, circa 100 C. The marble gleams under Mediterranean sun, vendors hawk their wares in rapid Latin, and the aroma of garum, that fermented fish sauce Romans couldn't live without, fills your nostrils. Citizens in togas hurry past carrying wax tablets, their sandaled feet clicking against polished stone pathways that have witnessed centuries of imperial glory. Street performers juggle colorful balls while children chase hoops with sticks, their laughter echoing off towering apartment buildings called insulae. But there's something you need to know before you reach for that coined purse with your left hand. You're about to commit what Romans considered a supernatural offense that could bring down the wrath of the gods themselves. You probably won't survive this revelation, but approximately 10% of the population you're mingling with right now carries what Romans believed to be a curse written into their very bones: the tendency to favor their left hand over their right. In Roman minds, these individuals weren't just different, they were walking omens of disaster, conduits for malevolent forces, and threats to the cosmic order that held their empire together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing our global bedtime community come together from every corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in that Roman street, watching a merchant accidentally drop his brown stylus while negotiating the price of Syrian silk. Without thinking, he reaches down with his left hand to retrieve it, and suddenly the crowd around him takes a collective step backward. Whispers ripple through the gathering like a stone dropped in still water. Sinister, they murmur, and you realize they're not describing his character, they're stating a literal fact about his physical being. The word sinister rolls off Roman tongues with the weight of cosmic dread because, to them, it simply means left. But this isn't just directional vocabulary. It's a linguistic time bomb that reveals how deeply left-handedness terrorized the Roman psyche. When a Roman called something sinister, they weren't making a metaphor. They were identifying an actual supernatural threat that emanated from the left side of existence itself. The etymology runs deeper than mere translation. Sinister derives from the Latin root meaning on the left side, while its opposite, dexter, meaning on the right, gave us our word. Dexterous, skillful, favorable, blessed. You watch as the merchant, realizing his mistake, quickly transfers the stylus to his right hand, but the damage is already done. The crowd has witnessed his natural inclination, his body's betrayal of what Romans considered proper cosmic alignment. Sweat beads on his forehead as he attempts to complete his transaction, but potential customers drift away like smoke. In their worldview, the universe operates on a fundamental duality. Right represents order, strength, divine favor, and auspicious fortune, while left embodies chaos, weakness, divine displeasure, and impending catastrophe. This isn't merely superstition in Roman thinking, it's physics. They believed the cosmos itself was structured around this left-right opposition, with gods dwelling on the right side of existence and malevolent spirits lurking on the left. When you moved, spoke, or acted with your left side leading, you were literally reaching into the realm of hostile supernatural forces and dragging their influence into the mortal world. Roman philosophers taught that the human body mirrored universal structure, the right side connected to celestial harmony, while the left side provided an unfortunate gateway for demonic interference. The merchant's predicament reveals a fascinating quirk of Roman society. They believed left-handed people possessed an involuntary connection to dark forces, yet simultaneously held them responsible for controlling this curse. It's like blaming someone for being struck by lightning while insisting they should have dodged the bolt. Romans expected left-handed individuals to fight their own nature constantly, viewing any slip into natural behavior as moral failure rather than biological inevitability. Historians still argue whether this Roman left phobia originated from their own cultural development or borrowed heavily from Greek predecessors, But the evidence suggests Romans amplified these fears to unprecedented levels. Where Greeks might view left-handedness as merely unfortunate, Romans treated it as actively dangerous. A distinction that would shape Western civilization's attitude toward left-handed individuals for nearly 2 millennia. You notice how the merchant now walks differently, keeping his left arm pressed against his side as if restraining a wild animal. This physical self-consciousness wasn't uncommon. Left-handed Romans lived in constant awareness that their natural instincts could trigger public alarm. They developed elaborate strategies to disguise their dominant hand, switching utensils mid-meal, learning to write right-handed despite the awkwardness, and training themselves to gesture exclusively with their right arms during public speaking. Some wealthy left-handed Romans even hired private tutors specifically to retrain their muscle memory. Imagine paying someone to teach you how to betray your own body. The irony hits you as you observe this scene. Rome, an empire built on military precision, engineering excellence, and administrative efficiency, was systematically handicapping 10% of its population based on which hand felt more comfortable holding a sword. But Romans would argue they weren't being irrational. They were protecting civilization itself from the creeping influence of cosmic disorder. As you continue through the streets, you begin to notice subtle architectural details that reinforce this left-right hierarchy. Doorways are designed to encourage right-footed entry. Public spaces funnel foot traffic in patterns that favor right-handed movement, and even the arrangement of market stalls seems calculated to disadvantage left-handed shoppers. The entire urban environment serves as a constant reminder that Roman society was built by and for the right-handed majority, with left-handed individuals expected to adapt or risk social ostracism. The merchant has disappeared into the crowd, probably heading home to practice right-handed penmanship by candlelight, but his brief moment of left-handed revelation has opened your eyes to a hidden layer of Roman anxiety that permeated every aspect of daily life. You follow the winding path up the Palatine Hill, where Rome's most sacred temples pierce the morning sky like marble fingers reaching toward the gods. The scent of burning incense mingles with sacrificial smoke as you approach the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. But something feels wrong. Priests huddle in urgent whispers near the altar, their faces etched with concern that borders on panic. You've stumbled upon one of Rome's most catastrophic religious crises. A left-handed priest has just performed the morning sacrifice, and according to Roman religious law, this single gesture has invalidated the entire ceremony, potentially bringing divine wrath upon the entire city. The head priest, a man named Marcus Aurelius Pontifex, stands trembling before the altar where wisps of smoke still rise from the ruined offering. His assistant, a young acolyte barely out of his teens, had reached across the sacred fire with his left hand to adjust the burning frankincense. In that split second of natural movement, he transformed a holy ritual into what Romans considered an act of cosmic vandalism. The morning sacrifice to Jupiter, meant to secure the god's protection for Rome's military campaigns in Dacia, now counted as worse than useless. It was an insult that could provoke divine retaliation. You watch as senior priests debate their options in hushed, frantic tones. Roman religious protocol demands absolute precision in every gesture, word, and movement during sacred ceremonies. The slightest deviation, a mispronounced syllable, an incorrectly positioned offering, or heaven forbid, a left-handed motion, could null and void hours of meticulous preparation. But left-handed gestures carried special horror because Romans believed they literally invited malevolent spirits to contaminate the sacred space. The theological reasoning behind this terror reveals the sophisticated cosmology that governed Roman religious thinking. They understood the universe as existing in perfect balance between beneficial and harmful forces, with religious ceremonies serving as carefully choreographed negotiations between mortals and immortals. Every ritual created what modern anthropologists might call a sacred bubble, a purified space where gods could manifest their presence without contamination from hostile spiritual entities. Left-handed movements punctured this bubble, allowing chaos to flood in and corrupt the entire proceedings. Historians still argue whether Roman priests truly believed left-handed gestures summoned demons or simply represented dangerous carelessness that gods found offensive, but the practical consequences were identical. Complete ritual failure requiring expensive and time-consuming repetition. Some wealthy Roman families spent fortunes repeating ceremonies multiple times when left-handed relatives accidentally disrupted the proceedings. The young acolyte who caused today's disaster stands apart from the group, tears streaming down his cheeks as he realizes his career in the priesthood has probably ended before it began. Roman religious law didn't typically punish left-handed individuals for their natural tendencies, but it absolutely prohibited them from serving in sacred roles where such tendencies could cause public catastrophe. This boy had likely hidden his left-handedness for months or years, training himself to perform every ritual gesture with his right hand, but one moment of unconscious movement had exposed his secret and destroyed his future. You notice how the other priests instinctively distanced themselves from the contaminated altar, as if left-handed spiritual pollution might spread like a contagious disease. This wasn't mere social prejudice. Roman religious texts explicitly warned that spaces touched by left-handed ritual movements required extensive purification before gods would accept offerings there again. The temple would need to undergo elaborate cleansing ceremonies involving specific herbs, prayers, and possibly animal sacrifices before normal worship could resume. The irony becomes apparent as you observe the cleanup process. Romans had developed incredibly sophisticated religious technologies for communicating with divine beings, yet they believed these same gods were so petty and narrow-minded that they'd punish entire cities for the handedness preferences of individual mortals. It's like building a supercomputer that crashes whenever someone sneezes nearby. Impressive engineering undermined by absurd sensitivity to trivial disturbances. Marcus Aurelius Pontifex finally announces his decision. The entire morning's sacrifice must be repeated from the beginning, with only confirmed right-handed priests participating. The cost in time, materials, and animals will be enormous, but Roman religious law offers no alternatives. The young acolyte gathers his belongings and walks slowly down the temple steps. His career in sacred service ended by an involuntary hand movement that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. As news of the incident spreads throughout the city, you realize this scene plays out regularly across the Roman Empire. Temples maintain careful records of which priests show any left-handed tendencies. Religious schools screen candidates for handedness before accepting them for training, and established priests live in constant awareness that a single unconscious gesture could invalidate years of faithful service. The entire Roman religious establishment operates under the assumption that their gods are simultaneously all-powerful and easily offended by the wrong choice of hands. But here's a detail that would make Romans even more anxious. Archaeological evidence suggests some of their most beloved emperors, including the military genius Julius Caesar, may have been naturally left-handed but trained themselves to appear right-handed in public. Imagine the cosmic implications if Romans discovered their greatest leaders had been unknowingly contaminating state ceremonies for decades. The religious panic would probably outlast the empire itself. The purification ritual begins as you descend the hill, but the morning's disaster has revealed something crucial about Roman psychology. Their fear of left-handedness wasn't just personal prejudice. It was institutional terror that their entire relationship with the divine could be sabotaged by the wrong hand reaching toward heaven. You find yourself standing in the Campus Martius at dawn, watching one of Rome's most crucial daily rituals unfold with the precision of a military operation. The augur, Rome's official fortune-teller, spreads his colorful striped cloak on the ground and begins the ancient art of reading bird flights to determine whether the gods favor today's planned Senate meeting. But there's a problem brewing in the eastern sky that will send shockwaves through the Roman political establishment. A flock of ravens is approaching from the left side of the augural viewing area, and in Roman divination, left side omens spell nothing but disaster. The augur, a distinguished man named Gaius Scribonius who's been interpreting divine signs for over 2 decades, immediately tenses as he spots the birds. His assistant quickly unfurls a scroll to record whatever prophecy emerges, but you can see the dread in both men's eyes. Roman augural science, and yes, they considered it a legitimate science, operates on the fundamental principle that the sky serves as a cosmic message board where gods communicate their intentions through animal behavior. Birds flying from the right side bring favorable omens, while left side bird flights announce impending doom with the reliability of a weather forecast. The ravens wheel overhead, their black wings catching the morning light as they perform what Romans would interpret as an aerial death sentence for today's political agenda. You watch the augur's face cycle through expressions of disbelief, calculation, and resignation as he realizes he'll have to advise the Senate that the gods explicitly oppose their planned discussions. The irony hits you immediately. Rome's most powerful political body could be paralyzed by the flight pattern of a few hungry birds who probably just spotted some interesting roadkill on the left side of the Campus Martius. But Roman augural theory goes deeper than simple left bad, right good superstition. They believed the entire sky was divided into sacred zones that corresponded to different divine jurisdictions and types of prophecy. The left side, that sinister region again, was specifically associated with underworld deities, malevolent spirits, and forces of chaos that opposed Roman prosperity. When birds flew from this cursed direction, they were literally carrying messages from Rome's enemies in the supernatural realm, delivering warnings or threats that demanded immediate political attention. Historians still argue whether Roman augurs genuinely believed in their divination methods or simply used bird reading as a convenient tool for manipulating political decisions, but the practical impact remained identical. Left-side omens could postpone Senate meetings, delay military campaigns, and cancel major religious festivals. The entire Roman governmental calendar operated around the assumption that bird behavior revealed divine political preferences. You notice how other Romans gathering in the Campus Martius react to the augur's obvious distress. Word spreads quickly through the crowd. Left side ravens. People whisper, and you see citizens immediately begin altering their daily plans. Merchants postpone major business deals, generals reconsider troop movements, and ordinary families decide to stay home rather than risk venturing out under such ominous auspices. The economic impact of a single bird flight from the wrong direction could cascade through the entire Roman economy within hours. The augur begins his formal proclamation, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority, as he announces that today's omens forbid any significant political or military activities. The ravens, he declares, bring warnings from the gods that Roman enemies, either foreign tribes or domestic conspirators, are planning actions that could threaten the empire's stability. Senate meetings must be postponed, military expeditions delayed, and all major contracts suspended until the augural signs improve. But here's where Roman augury gets truly bizarre. The same augur who's just paralyzed the government based on bird flight direction will tomorrow read omens from the exact same species flying from the exact same location. And if they approach from the right side instead, he'll declare the day supremely blessed for the most important state business. It's like having a traffic light that changes the speed limit for the entire city based on which direction the wind is blowing. The ravens complete their ominous flight and disappear over the Tiber. But their brief appearance has already triggered a complex chain of bureaucratic responses. Government clerks begin drafting official notices postponing scheduled votes. Military messengers ride out to inform legion commanders that planned advances must wait, and temple priests prepare additional sacrifices designed to appease whatever underworld deities sent this morning's sinister warning. The entire Roman administrative machine shifts into crisis mode because some birds chose to fly left instead of right. You follow the augur as he packs up his equipment, knowing he'll spend the rest of the day fielding urgent requests from senators, generals, and wealthy citizens who desperately need to know when the omens might improve. Roman augural records show that left-side bird flights could sometimes be counteracted by specific rituals or sacrifices, but the process was expensive, time-consuming, and never guaranteed to work. Some particularly stubborn left-side omens persisted for weeks, effectively freezing major government activities until the gods decided to send more cooperative birds from the right direction. The morning's augural disaster reveals something profound about Roman psychology. They had built the world's most powerful empire while simultaneously believing their political decisions should be determined by the navigational choices of random wildlife. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we didn't mention yet? Well, Romans were equally confident in both their military engineering and their conviction that ravens possessed supernatural political wisdom. As you leave the Campus Martius, the augur's assistant is already scanning the horizon for more bird activity, hoping to spot some right-flying eagles or hawks that might balance out the morning's sinister omens and allow Roman civilization to resume normal operations. You march alongside the legendary 10th Legion as they prepare for battle against Germanic tribes near the Rhine frontier. But something's wrong with the formation that's making veteran centurions break out in cold sweats. A left-handed soldier named Lucius Valerius has been assigned to the front rank of the testudo, Rome's famous tortoise formation, and his natural shield-handling instincts are disrupting the precise choreography that has made Roman legions unstoppable for centuries. What you're witnessing isn't just a military inconvenience. It's a crisis that Romans believed could doom entire campaigns by angering Mars, the god of war himself. The testudo formation represents the pinnacle of Roman military engineering, a human fortress created by overlapping shields that could withstand arrows, spears, and even burning oil poured from city walls. But this tactical masterpiece depends on every soldier moving with identical precision, raising and lowering their scutum shields in perfect synchronization with their right-handed comrades. When Lucius instinctively adjusts his shield with his left hand, he creates microscopic gaps in the formation that could prove fatal during actual combat. Centurion Marcus Brucius storms over to address the problem, his vine-stick swagger stick twitching with barely contained frustration. He's commanded legions for 15 years and has never encountered a tactical puzzle quite like this one. Roman military doctrine assumes all soldiers are right-handed, so every drill, every formation, and every combat technique has been developed around right-handed shield work and sword play. Accommodating a left-handed legionnaire would require rewriting centuries of battlefield tactics, assuming such accommodation were even possible without inviting divine military disaster. The theological implications of left-handed soldiers terrified Roman commanders even more than the tactical problems. They believed Mars personally designed Roman military formations as sacred geometries that channeled divine martial energy into mortal warriors. When soldiers moved in perfect right-handed unison, they created what modern military historians might call a spiritual amplification field that made Roman legions supernaturally effective in battle. Left-handed movements disrupted this divine synchronization, potentially leaving entire armies vulnerable to enemy magic and foreign gods. You watch as other legionnaires cast nervous glances at Lucius, who stands awkwardly trying to mirror their movements with his non-dominant hand. Roman military culture had developed elaborate superstitions around left-handed soldiers over the centuries. Some legions considered them bad luck omens who should be transferred to auxiliary units before major battles. Others believed left-handed warriors could inadvertently signal retreat or surrender to enemy forces, since left-hand gestures were universally associated with negative outcomes in Roman military symbolism. Historians still argue whether Roman armies actually performed worse when left-handed soldiers participated in standard formations, but anecdotal evidence from military chronicles suggests commanders genuinely feared such participation would provoke battlefield disasters. Some generals reportedly delayed major assaults for days when they discovered left-handed legionnaires in their front ranks, waiting for augural signs that the gods had forgiven this tactical contamination. The solution Centurion Brucius proposes reveals the creative lengths Romans would go to accommodate left-handed soldiers without completely abandoning them. Lucius will be reassigned to the legion's engineering corps, where his left-handedness might actually prove useful for specialized construction tasks that don't require formation fighting. Roman military engineers had discovered that left-handed workers sometimes excelled at building siege equipment, handling specialized tools, and performing maintenance tasks that benefited from different spatial approaches. But even this accommodation comes with restrictions designed to minimize supernatural military risks. Left-handed engineers couldn't participate in pre-battle weapon blessing ceremonies, where their gestures might contaminate the ritual sanctification of Roman arms and armor. They were often assigned to rearguard positions during major engagements, keeping them away from the sacred frontline formations where Mars was believed to manifest most powerfully during combat. The irony becomes apparent as you observe the legion's training exercises. Roman military effectiveness depended on adaptability, innovation, and tactical flexibility, yet they were willing to waste the potential contributions of 10% of their soldiers based on handedness superstitions. Some of Rome's most famous military disasters, including the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, might have been prevented if commanders had been less concerned about left-handed spiritual contamination and more focused on practical battlefield advantages. Lucius accepts his reassignment with visible relief, understanding that engineering work offers better career prospects than struggling through formation drills with his non-dominant hand. But you notice how his transfer creates a ripple effect throughout the Legion. Other soldiers begin observing each other more carefully for signs of left-handed tendencies, creating an atmosphere of mutual surveillance that undermines the trust and cohesion essential for effective military units. The Germanic tribes watching from across the Rhine probably had no idea that Roman military preparations were being complicated by handedness anxieties, but they would certainly have exploited such knowledge if they possessed it. Imagine barbarian war chiefs learning that they could potentially disrupt Roman formations by targeting left-handed legionnaires or by spreading rumors that left-handed soldiers brought battlefield curses. Psychological warfare tactics that might have proved more effective than direct military confrontation. As the Legion completes its morning drills, you realize that Roman military culture had created a fascinating paradox. The world's most professional army was simultaneously convinced that the gods judged their tactical competence based on which hands their soldiers preferred to use. The testudo formation remains as deadly as ever, but 10% of Rome's potential military talent has been relegated to secondary roles because Mars apparently has strong opinions about ambidextrous diversity in the ranks. You descend into the hypogeum beneath the Colosseum, where gladiators prepare for combat in torchlit chambers that smell of sweat, fear, and lion dung. The roar of 50,000 spectators filters down through the arena floor above as you witness something that would send ripples of anxiety through the crowd if they knew. A left-handed gladiator named Spartacus Minor is being equipped for today's featured bout, and according to Roman superstition, his very presence in the arena threatens to curse every spectator who watches him fight. The lanista, the gladiator trainer who manages this particular school, paces nervously as his attendants strap bronze arm guards onto Spartacus Minor's left forearm. Roman gladiatorial culture had developed elaborate theories about how left-handed fighters disrupted the cosmic balance of arena combat, potentially transforming entertainment spectacles into supernatural disasters that could affect the entire city. When left-handed gladiators entered the sand, they weren't just fighting their opponents, they were battling the universe's natural order itself. Spartacus Minor stands 6 feet tall with the build of a professional killer, but his left-handedness makes him a walking contradiction in Roman eyes, simultaneously more dangerous and more cursed than his right-handed colleagues. Left-handed gladiators often possess tactical advantages in the arena, since most opponents trained exclusively against right-handed fighting styles. Their unfamiliar attack angles and reverse defensive patterns could confuse even experienced fighters, leading to spectacular victories that crowds found both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The theological problem with left-handed gladiators reveals the complex spiritual machinery Romans believed operated during arena spectacles. They understood gladiatorial combat as ritualized sacrifice that honored the gods while providing divine entertainment, with each bout serving as a miniature religious ceremony where blood offerings appeased supernatural audiences. Left-handed fighters disrupted this sacred choreography by introducing sinister spiritual energy into spaces specifically consecrated for right-handed divine worship. You watch as other gladiators in the preparation chambers cast sideways glances at Spartacus Minor, their superstitions ranging from mild unease to outright terror. Some fighters refused to train with left-handed opponents, believing such practice sessions could transfer cursed luck that would doom them in actual combat. Others considered left-handed gladiators to be possessed by malevolent spirits, explaining their unorthodox fighting abilities as supernatural rather than simply biomechanical advantages. Roman crowd psychology around left-handed gladiators created fascinating betting paradoxes that shrewd gamblers learned to exploit. Spectators often wagered against left-handed fighters regardless of their actual combat records, driving down the odds and creating opportunities for informed bettors who understood that superstition was inflating the potential payouts. Some wealthy Romans made fortunes by consistently backing talented left-handed gladiators whose supernatural reputation kept their odds artificially high. Historians still argue whether gladiatorial schools deliberately recruited left-handed fighters for their shock value or tried to avoid them due to crowd superstitions, but surviving records suggest both strategies were employed depending on the specific audience and political context. Some emperors apparently enjoyed the controversy generated by left-handed gladiators, using their matches to demonstrate imperial power over both human opponents and cosmic forces. The armor being fitted onto Spartacus Minor tells its own story about Roman attempts to neutralize left-handed spiritual contamination. His gear has been blessed by priests specifically trained in purification rituals designed to contain sinister energy, and small protective amulets have been sewn into his leather straps. The Lanista explains that these precautions won't eliminate the supernatural risks, but they might prevent left-handed curse luck from spreading to other fighters or seeping into the arena's foundations. As you climb the stairs toward the arena floor, the crowd's excitement reaches fever pitch, but you notice how quickly the mood shifts when the announcer identifies Spartacus Minor as a left-handed fighter. Cheers become murmurs, and spectators begin making protective gestures, touching iron jewelry, spitting 3 times, or quietly reciting prayers to ward off potential misfortune. Some audience members simply leave, unwilling to risk exposure to whatever supernatural consequences might result from watching sinister gladiatorial combat. The bout itself unfolds with the brutal efficiency that made Roman arena entertainment famous throughout the ancient world, but every move Spartacus Minor makes with his left hand sends visible ripples of anxiety through the crowd. When he lands a killing blow with his left-handed sword thrust, the spectators erupt in confused celebration mixed with obvious fear. They're simultaneously thrilled by the spectacular combat, and terrified that they've witnessed a cursed victory that might bring them personal misfortune. But here's the detail that would horrify Romans even more than left-handed gladiators. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of Rome's most beloved arena champions, including fighters whose victories were celebrated in poetry and commemorated in mosaics, may have been naturally left-handed but trained to fight right-handed to avoid crowd superstitions. Imagine the cultural panic if Romans discovered their greatest gladiatorial heroes had been suppressing their natural abilities to accommodate supernatural prejudices. Emperor Trajan watches from the imperial box as Spartacus Minor raises his sword in victory, but even imperial approval can't completely overcome the crowd's ambivalence about left-handed triumph. Remember that disrupted religious ceremony we witnessed earlier? The same spiritual anxieties that paralyzed temple worship now cast shadows over what should have been pure entertainment spectacle. As the sand is raked clean and fresh fighters enter the arena, you realize that Roman gladiatorial culture had created yet another institutional framework where 10% of potential talent was either wasted or viewed with supernatural suspicion, limiting the empire's ability to fully utilize its human resources in pursuit of divine entertainment. You step away from the blood-soaked arena sand and find yourself transported to a more intimate but equally treacherous Roman battlefield, a wedding ceremony in the home of Senator Marcus Claudius, where the bride's left-handed gesture during the ring exchange has just plunged the entire celebration into supernatural crisis. The guests freeze in horrified silence as Julia accidentally extends her left hand to receive the iron wedding ring, and you watch the groom's face drain of color as he realizes his marriage may now be cursed with infertility, bad luck, and divine abandonment before it even officially begins. Roman wedding ceremonies operated according to precise ritual choreography that left no room for sinister improvisation, and every gesture carried spiritual weight that could determine whether the gods would bless or curse the union. The bride was required to accept the ring with her right hand while facing east, recite her vows while stepping forward with her right foot first, and perform the symbolic joining of hands using only right-handed contact. Left-handed movements during these sacred moments were believed to invite malevolent spirits into the marriage bed and guarantee that any children born from the union would inherit supernatural contamination. The wedding guests begin murmuring protective prayers under their breath while the bride's mother frantically signals for a priest to perform emergency purification rituals before the ceremony can continue. Roman families spent months planning wedding ceremonies with obsessive attention to preventing left-handed accidents, hiring special attendants whose sole job was monitoring the bride and groom for any inadvertent sinister movements that could doom the marriage before consummation. Some wealthy families even employed left-handed detection specialists who observed rehearsal ceremonies to identify potential danger points where nervous couples might make catastrophic gestural mistakes. You notice how the wedding preparations themselves reveal Roman paranoia about left-handed contamination spreading through sacred domestic spaces. The marriage bed has been positioned so that both spouses will naturally reach for each other with their right hands during intimate moments, and all ceremonial objects, rings, cups, ceremonial daggers used in sacrifice, have been arranged to encourage right-handed handling. The household slaves responsible for serving the wedding feast have been specifically instructed to present food and wine from angles that make left-handed acceptance nearly impossible. But here's where Roman wedding superstitions created genuinely tragic human consequences. Left-handed brides often face brutal pre-marriage training designed to suppress their natural hand preferences and prevent wedding day disasters. Young women destined for important political marriages underwent months of right-handed conditioning that included having their left hands tied behind their backs during practice ceremonies, physical punishment for unconscious left-handed gestures, and psychological conditioning designed to create automatic fear responses to left-handed impulses. The priest arrives with his purification kit and begins the complex ritual cleansing required to neutralize Julia's left-handed ring acceptance. But you can see doubt in everyone's eyes about whether divine contamination can truly be reversed once it has entered a sacred ceremony. Roman religious authorities had developed elaborate theological debates about whether left-handed wedding mistakes represented momentary lapses that could be corrected through proper ritual intervention, or permanent spiritual wounds that would fester throughout the entire marriage. Historians still argue whether Roman wedding left-handedness taboos originated from practical concerns about military alliances and political partnerships, or purely supernatural fears about domestic harmony being disrupted by sinister spiritual influence. Marriage contracts sometimes included specific clauses about hand preference requirements and ritual compensation if either spouse displayed left-handed tendencies that could endanger the family's divine protection. The groom, Marcus Junius, faces a terrible decision as the purification ritual continues: proceed with a potentially cursed marriage that could destroy his political career and family lineage, or break the engagement and face massive financial penalties plus social humiliation that might end his senatorial ambitions. Roman men in these situations often chose to marry left-handed contaminated brides but immediately began seeking religious solutions that could transfer the supernatural curse to slaves, animals, or captured enemies through elaborate magical ceremonies. You watch as Julia herself becomes increasingly distressed, not just because her innocent mistake threatens her marriage, but because Roman culture had conditioned women to believe that left-handed tendencies represented fundamental spiritual defects that made them unworthy of divine protection during childbirth. Many Roman women who displayed sinister preferences during wedding ceremonies subsequently suffered from anxiety disorders, convinced that any miscarriages, infant deaths, or domestic problems resulted from their cursed hand preferences contaminating their households. The wedding feast proceeds with forced celebration, while guests nervously monitor both bride and groom for additional left-handed slip-ups that could compound the supernatural damage already inflicted on the marriage. Roman wedding receptions often devolved into tense surveillance operations where family members watched each other's hand movements more carefully than they enjoyed the food and entertainment, creating social gatherings that felt more like military exercises than joyful celebrations. Remember that gladiatorial arena where left-handed fighters disrupted sacred combat? The same spiritual anxieties now transform what should be Rome's most intimate celebration into another battlefield where sinister forces threaten to overwhelm divine order through simple human biomechanics. But the most devastating aspect of Roman wedding left-handedness fears may have been their impact on child-rearing practices within marriages that survived initial contamination. Parents who believed their union had been cursed by left-handed wedding gestures often became obsessively vigilant about preventing their children from developing sinister preferences, creating household environments where natural human variation was treated as evidence of supernatural infection that required immediate and brutal correction. As the evening progresses and the purification rituals conclude with uncertain success, you realize that Roman wedding culture had transformed one of humanity's most universal celebrations into yet another arena where left-handed Romans faced systematic exclusion from normal social participation, forcing them to navigate life's most important personal relationships while hiding or suppressing their natural abilities to avoid supernatural persecution. You follow the wedding party's nervous procession to the Roman Forum, where a crucial legal matter awaits resolution, but the supernatural anxiety from Julia's left-handed ring acceptance pales in comparison to what you're about to witness in the Basilica courts. A left-handed citizen named Gaius Flavius attempting to take a legal oath, which Roman law considers impossible because sinister hand placement during sacred vows automatically invalidates testimony before both human judges and divine witnesses. The praetor overseeing today's proceedings shifts uncomfortably on his ivory chair as court officials debate whether Flavius can legally participate in Roman justice when his very hand preference marks him as spiritually unreliable. Roman legal theory had developed complex theological frameworks explaining why left-handed oath-taking represented perjury before the gods regardless of the witness's actual honesty or character. When citizens raised their hands to swear testimony, they were invoking divine authority to validate their statements, and left-handed gestures during these moments were believed to summon malevolent spirits who would contaminate the entire legal proceeding with false information. Roman courts operated on the assumption that the gods actively participated in judicial decisions, making sinister spiritual contamination a legitimate legal concern rather than mere superstition. The court stenographer, a Greek slave trained in rapid writing techniques, pauses his transcription as legal scholars huddled around the praetor debate precedents for handling left-handed witnesses in cases involving property disputes, criminal accusations, and inheritance claims. Roman legal archives contained extensive documentation of trials that were declared invalid after judges discovered that key witnesses had used left hands during oath ceremonies, forcing expensive and time-consuming retrials that could drag on for years while evidence deteriorated and memories faded. You watch as Flavius himself becomes increasingly frustrated, not just because his natural hand preference prevents him from participating in legal proceedings that could determine his family's financial future, but because Roman legal culture offered no accommodation for citizens whose sinister tendencies were involuntary rather than malicious. Some left-handed Romans attempted to circumvent oath-taking restrictions by having right-handed family members or business partners serve as legal proxies. But these arrangements often created additional complications when opposing lawyers challenged the legitimacy of proxy testimony given on behalf of spiritually contaminated principles. The theological problem with left-handed legal participation reveals how Roman religious authorities had systematically excluded sinister citizens from fundamental civic rights based on supernatural theories about divine communication and spiritual contamination. Roman priests serving as legal advisors argued that left-handed oath-taking didn't just threaten individual trial outcomes. It could anger the gods sufficiently to withdraw divine protection from Rome's entire judicial system, potentially leading to legal chaos that could destabilize the empire itself. Court officials bring out special purification equipment designed to neutralize potential left-handed contamination before Flavius attempts his testimony, including blessed oils, protective amulets, and incense burners filled with herbs specifically chosen to repel sinister spiritual influences. Roman legal procedure had evolved elaborate ritual preparations for handling left-handed witnesses, though legal scholars remained divided about whether these purifications actually enabled legitimate testimony or simply provided psychological comfort to nervous judges and jury members who feared supernatural retribution. Historians still argue whether Roman legal restrictions on left-handed citizens represented genuine religious conviction or convenient excuses for excluding politically inconvenient testimony from legal proceedings. But surviving court records suggest that left-handed legal disability was enforced with remarkable consistency across different regions and historical periods. Some legal historians theorize that wealthy Romans occasionally bribed court officials to declare their opponents' witnesses left-handed as a strategy for invalidating damaging testimony, though proving such corruption remains challenging given incomplete archival records. The praetor finally announces his decision. Flavius may attempt to provide testimony, but only after undergoing extensive purification rituals and swearing his oath with his right hand while keeping his left hand bound behind his back to prevent accidental sinister contamination. This compromise satisfies either the strict religious authorities who believe left-handed citizens should be completely excluded from legal proceedings, nor the practical administrators who recognize that blanket exclusions could make many trials impossible when key witnesses happen to be naturally sinister. You notice how the courtroom atmosphere becomes tense and uncomfortable as Flavius struggles to bind his left hand securely enough to satisfy religious requirements, while maintaining enough mobility to gesture naturally during his testimony. Roman legal proceedings often devolved into bizarre theatrical performances when left-handed witnesses were involved, with court sessions focusing more on hand-binding techniques and purification protocols than actual evidence evaluation and legal reasoning. The jury members, wealthy Roman citizens selected for their supposed moral character and divine favor, watch nervously as Flavius begins his testimony, many of them making protective gestures and quietly reciting prayers to ward off potential supernatural contamination that could follow them home and endanger their own families. Roman legal culture had created courtroom environments where supernatural anxiety often outweighed rational evidence evaluation, leading to verdicts influenced more by religious paranoia than factual analysis. Remember that cursed wedding ceremony where left-handed gestures threatened divine blessing? The same spiritual fears now poison Roman legal proceedings, transforming courts of justice into arenas where natural human variation becomes grounds for systematic exclusion from civic participation and constitutional protection. But here's the detail that would shock Romans even more than left-handed witnesses. Some of Rome's most celebrated legal minds, including jurists whose opinions became foundational elements of Roman law that influenced legal systems for centuries, may have been naturally left-handed but forced to suppress their preferences to participate in legal careers. Imagine discovering that fundamental principles of Western jurisprudence were developed by legal scholars who spent their entire professional lives hiding their natural abilities to avoid supernatural persecution. As Flavius concludes his testimony and the court begins deliberating his credibility, you realize that Roman legal culture had created yet another institutional barrier where left-handed citizens faced systematic discrimination that limited their access to justice, economic opportunity, and basic civic rights that other Romans took for granted. You leave the basilica where Gaius Flavius struggled with his legally compromised testimony and find yourself standing before the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, where Roman architects and priests are engaged in heated debate about a disturbing structural problem. The temple's sacred geometry has been disrupted by the discovery that several supporting columns were carved by left-handed stonemasons, and religious authorities now fear that sinister craftsmanship has contaminated the entire building's ability to channel divine energy properly. The Pontifex Maximus gestures frantically at marble columns that look identical to untrained eyes, but which supposedly carry spiritual pollution that could turn Rome's most sacred temple into a beacon for malevolent supernatural forces. Roman architectural theory operated on complex mathematical principles that connected building proportions, spatial arrangements, and construction techniques to cosmic harmony, with every element designed to facilitate proper communication between human worshippers and divine powers. Temples were understood as precision instruments for focusing spiritual energy, and left-handed craftsmanship was believed to introduce chaotic distortions that could reverse the flow of divine blessing, potentially transforming sacred spaces into supernatural danger zones that attracted demons rather than gods. The lead architect, Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, yes, the same Vitruvius whose architectural writings would influence building design for centuries, examines the problematic columns with growing concern as he explains how left-handed stonework creates subtle asymmetries that human eyes can't detect but which allegedly disrupt the sacred mathematical relationships that enable temples to function as divine communication devices. Roman builders had developed elaborate quality control procedures designed to identify and reject left-handed craftsmanship before it could contaminate religious architecture, though these inspections often delayed construction projects for months while specialists examined every carved detail for signs of sinister spiritual contamination. You watch as temple maintenance crews begin the expensive and technically challenging process of replacing the left-handed columns, a project that requires dismantling significant portions of the roof structure and carefully extracting massive marble cylinders without damaging surrounding stonework. Roman religious authorities considered such renovations essential for maintaining divine favor, but the financial costs often bankrupted temple construction budgets and forced communities to choose between architectural purity and practical functionality when building sacred spaces. The theological problem with left-handed architecture reveals how Roman religious thinking had extended supernatural concerns into every aspect of physical construction, creating building codes that prioritized spiritual considerations over structural engineering or aesthetic beauty. Temples were required to be constructed entirely with right-handed craftsmanship, oriented according to specific astronomical alignments, and proportioned according to sacred mathematical ratios that supposedly enabled proper divine communication. Left-handed builders were systematically excluded from religious construction projects, limiting the available talent pool and often forcing communities to import expensive right-handed craftsmen from distant regions. But here's where Roman architectural superstitions created fascinating contradictions between religious requirements and practical reality. Many of Rome's most impressive engineering achievements, including aqueducts, roads, and public buildings that required left-handed workers to complete complex construction tasks, existed in constant tension with religious authorities who worried about sinister contamination spreading from secular projects into sacred spaces. Some Roman engineers secretly employed left-handed craftsmen for technically demanding work, while publicly maintaining right-handed construction policies to avoid religious controversy. Historians still argue whether Roman architectural restrictions on left-handed builders originated from genuine engineering concerns about construction quality or purely supernatural fears about spiritual contamination. But surviving building records suggest that hand preference discrimination was enforced with remarkable consistency across different types of construction projects. Some architectural historians theorize that left-handed building restrictions may have inadvertently contributed to the eventual decline of Roman construction quality, as the empire systematically excluded skilled craftsmen based on irrelevant biological characteristics rather than actual building competence. The Pontifex Maximus announces that emergency purification rituals will be performed throughout the temple complex to neutralize potential spiritual damage from the left-handed columns. But you can see skepticism in the faces of practical-minded engineers who understand that structural integrity depends on mathematical precision rather than supernatural blessing. Roman religious architecture often became battlegrounds between theological orthodoxy and engineering reality, with construction projects grinding to halts while priests and builders argued about whether spiritual purity or structural stability should take priority in sacred building design. You notice how the temple workers themselves reveal the human cost of architectural left-handedness discrimination. Skilled stonemasons, carpenters, and metalworkers whose natural abilities made them valuable craftsmen in private construction projects were systematically excluded from the most prestigious and well-paying religious building assignments that could establish their professional reputations and provide economic security for their families. Roman architectural culture had created a two-tiered construction industry where left-handed builders faced career limitations regardless of their actual skill levels or artistic achievements. The replacement column installation proceeds with elaborate ritual supervision as priests monitor every hammer blow and chisel stroke to ensure that only right-handed craftsmanship touches the sacred stonework, creating construction sites that resembled religious ceremonies more than practical building projects. Roman temple construction often required twice as long as comparable secular buildings due to religious quality control procedures that prioritized supernatural compliance over construction efficiency. Remember that legal courtroom where left-handed citizens struggled to provide valid testimony? The same spiritual anxieties now extend into Roman architecture, transforming construction projects into religious battlefields where natural human variation threatens to contaminate humanity's attempts to communicate with divine powers through physical structures. But the most ironic aspect of Roman architectural left-handedness fears may be their impact on building preservation and historical legacy. Many temples and public buildings that Romans considered spiritually pure due to exclusive right-handed construction have crumbled over centuries. While some structures built with mixed left-handed and right-handed craftsmanship have survived as testaments to practical engineering skill rather than supernatural orthodoxy, the columns that Romans worried would attract demons have often proven more durable than their religiously correct replacements. As the sun sets behind the newly purified Temple of Jupiter and construction crews clean up their tools, you realize that Roman architectural culture had transformed building design from a practical craft focused on creating functional and beautiful structures into another arena where left-handed Romans faced systematic exclusion from economic opportunities and creative expression. forcing talented craftsmen to hide their natural abilities or accept career limitations based on supernatural prejudices rather than actual construction competence. You descend from the purified temple of Jupiter into the narrow streets of the Subura district, where you discover a different kind of Roman expertise being applied to the left-handedness problem. A physician named Galen, yes, that Galen, whose medical theories would dominate European medicine for over 1,000 years, is examining a young patient whose parents brought him for treatment of what they consider a dangerous medical condition requiring immediate intervention. The boy sits nervously on a wooden examination table while Galen explains his revolutionary theory that left-handedness results from an imbalance of bodily humors that has allowed corrupted blood to accumulate in the right side of the brain, creating sinister behavioral patterns that threaten both individual health and social stability. Roman medical theory had developed sophisticated explanations for left-handedness that blended anatomical observation with supernatural belief, creating treatment protocols that doctors considered scientifically advanced but which modern medicine would recognize as systematic torture disguised as healthcare. Physicians like Galen argued that the human body contained 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that left-handedness indicated dangerous accumulations of corrupted humors that could spread throughout the body like a disease, eventually affecting not just hand preference but mental stability, moral character, and spiritual health. The examination room contains an impressive array of medical instruments that Galen will use to diagnose the specific type of humoral imbalance causing the boy's left-handedness: bronze cupping vessels for bloodletting, silver needles for acupuncture-style treatments, herbal preparations designed to purge corrupted fluids from the digestive system, and restraining devices used to immobilize patients during painful corrective procedures. Roman medicine had elevated left-handedness treatment into a prestigious medical specialty that required years of training and generated substantial income for physicians who claimed expertise in humoral rebalancing techniques. You watch as Galen begins his diagnostic process by examining the boy's urine color, checking his pulse rhythms, and palpating his skull to identify areas where corrupted blood might be pooling near the brain's surface. Roman physicians believed they could detect left-handedness through subtle physical signs that indicated internal humoral corruption: slightly asymmetrical facial features, differences in eye color intensity, variations in fingernail growth patterns, and temperature differences between the left and right sides of the body that supposedly revealed underlying spiritual contamination. The boy's parents listen anxiously as Galen explains that untreated left-handedness could progress into more serious medical conditions including melancholia, epilepsy, homosexual tendencies, and eventually complete moral dissolution that would make their son unemployable and unmarriageable. Roman families often invested enormous resources in left-handedness medical treatment, selling property and borrowing money to pay for expensive procedures that physicians claimed could prevent their children from becoming social outcasts doomed to lives of supernatural persecution and economic disadvantage. But here's where Roman medical left-handedness treatment reveals the genuinely horrific intersection between pseudoscience and systematic cruelty. Many of the corrective procedures that Galen and his colleagues prescribed involved deliberate physical trauma designed to force the brain to reorganize its control patterns through pain and fear conditioning. Left-handed children underwent bloodletting sessions that weakened them for weeks, herbal poisoning that caused severe digestive distress, and physical restraint therapies that prevented them from using their dominant hands until they developed compensatory right-handed abilities through desperation and survival instinct. Galen begins preparing his treatment recommendations, which include a regimen of controlled bleeding to drain corrupted humors from the boy's system, dietary restrictions designed to prevent the formation of additional sinister fluids, and physical therapy exercises that will gradually strengthen right-handed motor patterns while weakening left-handed neural pathways. Roman medical culture had created an entire industry around left-handedness correction that generated substantial profits for physicians while causing immeasurable psychological and physical damage to children whose only medical problem was natural biological variation. Historians still argue whether Roman physicians genuinely believed their humoral theories about left-handedness or simply provided medical justification for social prejudices that families wanted to address through professional intervention. but surviving medical texts suggest that doctors like Galen developed increasingly elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain treatment failures and justify more aggressive corrective procedures. Some medical historians theorize that left-handedness treatment may have been one of the first examples of systematic medical abuse disguised as scientific healthcare, establishing patterns of pseudoscientific persecution that would reappear throughout history. The examination continues as Galen measures the boy's head circumference, checks his reflexes, and tests his grip strength to establish baseline measurements that will supposedly demonstrate treatment effectiveness over time. Roman medical documentation required extensive record-keeping that tracked patients' progress through corrective therapy, creating archives that physicians used to refine their techniques and justify their fees to wealthy families desperate to normalize their left-handed children. You notice how the medical consultation itself traumatizes the young patient, who becomes increasingly distressed as adults discuss his hand preference as evidence of internal corruption that requires painful correction. Roman left-handedness medical treatment often caused severe psychological damage that persisted long after the physical therapies ended, creating adults who associated their natural abilities with shame, fear, and memories of medical torture that had been inflicted with their parents' approval and society's encouragement. The treatment room fills with the smell of burning herbs as Galen prepares purification incense that will supposedly cleanse corrupted spiritual energy while the medical procedures address physical humoral imbalances, demonstrating how Roman medicine blended supernatural belief with anatomical theory in ways that doubled the potential for patient harm. Medical left-handedness treatment combined the worst aspects of religious persecution and pseudoscientific healthcare, subjecting children to systematic abuse that was both spiritually and medically justified. Remember that contaminated temple architecture where left-handed craftsmanship threatened divine communication. The same supernatural fears now infiltrate Roman medicine, transforming healthcare into another battlefield where natural human variation is treated as disease requiring aggressive intervention rather than normal biological diversity deserving acceptance and accommodation. But the most tragic aspect of Roman medical left-handedness treatment may be its long-term impact on victims who survived corrective therapy. Many left-handed Romans who underwent humoral rebalancing procedures suffered from chronic health problems, psychological disorders, and social anxiety that made them less capable of contributing to Roman society than they would have been if their natural abilities had simply been accepted rather than medically corrected. The cure was invariably worse than the supposed disease. As Galen concludes his examination and begins mixing herbal preparations for the boy's first treatment session, you realize that Roman medical culture had created yet another institutional framework for persecuting left-handed citizens. This time with the authority of scientific expertise and the promise of therapeutic benefit that made systematic abuse feel like compassionate healthcare rather than organized cruelty. You leave Galen's medical chamber where that poor boy faces humoral rebalancing therapy and find yourself transported to a Roman elementary school in the Aventine district, where an 8-year-old girl named Claudia has just made a fatal mistake. She picked up her wax tablet stylus with her left hand, and now the grammaticus, the primary school teacher responsible for basic literacy instruction, is preparing to administer the brutal corrective punishment that Roman educational theory considers essential for preventing sinister contamination from spreading through the classroom and corrupting other students' learning abilities. The other children watch in terrified silence as Claudia's left hand is bound to her desk with leather straps while the teacher prepares a bundle of birch switches specifically reserved for left-handedness correction. Roman educational philosophy operated on the fundamental assumption that proper learning required right-handed motor coordination, and that allowing left-handed writing, reading gestures, or classroom participation would contaminate the sacred process of knowledge transmission that connected students to centuries of Roman intellectual achievement. Teachers were trained to identify left-handed tendencies in young children and eliminate them through systematic physical correction that combined pain conditioning with public humiliation designed to create automatic fear responses to sinister impulses that could interfere with proper education. The classroom itself reveals how Roman schools had been specifically designed to prevent left-handed contamination. Desks are arranged so that natural lighting comes from the right side only, forcing left-handed students to twist awkwardly to avoid shadowing their work, writing implements are distributed from positions that encourage right-handed grasping. And classroom activities are structured around right-handed movement patterns that make left-handed participation practically impossible. Roman educational architecture had systematically excluded sinister students from comfortable learning environments, creating physical spaces that reinforced supernatural prejudices through practical design choices. You watch as Claudia begins to cry, not just from physical pain but from the psychological trauma of being publicly identified as spiritually defective in front of her classmates, who have been taught that left-handed students represent potential sources of intellectual contamination that could interfere with their own educational progress. Roman schools often became battlegrounds where children learned to fear and persecute natural human variation rather than focusing on actual academic subjects like mathematics, rhetoric, or literature that would prepare them for adult civic participation. The Grammaticus explains his corrective methodology to a visiting school inspector, describing how left-handedness educational intervention must be swift and decisive to prevent sinister motor patterns from becoming permanently established in young minds. Roman teachers believed that children's brains remain malleable until approximately age 12, creating a critical window during which aggressive correction could supposedly force neural reorganization that would eliminate left-handed preferences and replace them with properly right-handed cognitive patterns. But here's where Roman educational left-handedness persecution reveals its most devastating long-term consequences. Children who survived school correction programs often suffered from learning disabilities, anxiety disorders, and motor coordination problems that made them less educationally successful than they would have been if their natural abilities had been accommodated rather than brutally suppressed. Roman schools were systematically creating educational failure through policies designed to promote academic success, producing adults whose intellectual capabilities had been damaged by the very institutions supposedly responsible for developing their minds. The correction session continues as other teachers arrive to observe proper left-handedness intervention techniques, turning Claudia's punishment into a professional development exercise where educators learn effective methods for identifying and eliminating sinister tendencies in future students. Roman teacher training included extensive instruction in left-handedness detection and correction, creating an educational system where suppressing natural human variation was considered as important as teaching actual academic content. Historians still argue whether Roman educational restrictions on left-handed students originated from practical concerns about writing uniformity and classroom management, or purely supernatural fears about spiritual contamination spreading through schools. But surviving pedagogical texts suggest that teachers genuinely believed sinister students posed existential threats to educational effectiveness. Some educational historians theorize that left-handedness school persecution may have significantly reduced Roman literacy rates by systematically excluding or traumatizing students whose natural abilities could have contributed to intellectual and cultural development. The school inspector takes detailed notes about correction techniques while Claudia struggles to write with her right hand, her letters shaky and barely legible as she attempts to satisfy educational requirements that prioritize hand preference conformity over actual learning achievement. Roman educational assessment often focused more on supernatural compliance than academic competence, creating evaluation systems where students were judged on their ability to suppress natural abilities rather than demonstrate knowledge acquisition or intellectual growth. You notice how the classroom atmosphere becomes tense and fearful as other students observe Claudia's correction, many of them unconsciously checking their own hand positions to ensure they're not accidentally displaying sinister tendencies that could mark them for similar punishment. Roman schools created educational environments where children learned to monitor and suppress their natural behaviors rather than explore intellectual curiosity, transforming learning spaces into surveillance systems where supernatural orthodoxy took precedence over educational effectiveness. The lesson continues with other students practicing their writing exercises while carefully avoiding any left-handed gestures that might attract teacher attention, creating classroom dynamics where academic focus was constantly interrupted by supernatural anxiety about hand position, tool handling, and movement patterns. Roman education often prioritized conformity enforcement over knowledge transmission, producing graduates who were well trained in suppressing natural variation but potentially deficient in critical thinking skills or creative problem-solving abilities. Remember that medical chamber where Galen treated left-handedness as humoral disease? The same systematic persecution now extends into Roman education, transforming schools from institutions designed to develop human potential into training grounds for supernatural conformity that damaged children's intellectual development in pursuit of spiritual orthodoxy. But the most tragic aspect of Roman educational left-handedness persecution may be its impact on intellectual innovation and cultural creativity. Many of Rome's potential poets, philosophers, engineers, and artists may have had their talents suppressed or destroyed by educational systems that prioritized hand-preference conformity over actual intellectual ability. The empire may have systematically eliminated much of its creative potential through policies designed to maintain supernatural purity in learning environments. The school day ends with Claudia still struggling to write legibly with her right hand while other students pack their materials and prepare to return home, many of them carrying psychological scars from witnessing systematic persecution that taught them to fear their own natural abilities rather than embrace their individual talents. Roman schools had transformed education from a process of intellectual development into training programs for supernatural conformity that created adults conditioned to suppress natural human variation rather than celebrate intellectual diversity. As you leave the classroom where educational brutality masquerades as pedagogical necessity, you realize that Roman educational culture had created yet another institutional framework for persecuting left-handed citizens. This time targeting children at their most vulnerable developmental stage and damaging their intellectual potential in pursuit of supernatural orthodoxy that had no basis in actual educational effectiveness or learning theory. You leave that brutal classroom where young Claudia still struggles with her bound hand and find yourself transported to the bustling Subura marketplace at dawn, where a left-handed spice merchant named Marcus Flavius is about to discover that his natural hand preference will cost him not just customers, but his entire livelihood. As Roman commercial culture had developed elaborate supernatural protocols that systematically excluded sinister traders from participating in the economic prosperity that defined imperial success. The morning crowd gathers around various stalls, but you notice how shoppers instinctively avoid Marcus's booth when they observe him measuring saffron with his left hand, their faces displaying the same fearful recognition that marks left-handed people as sources of commercial contamination throughout Roman society. Roman commercial superstitions operated on the fundamental belief that left-handed merchants possessed an inherent ability to curse transactions, spoil goods through sinister contact, and transfer bad luck to customers who purchased items handled by spiritually defective traders. Market regulations in major cities like Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch included specific provisions requiring merchants to demonstrate right-handed competency before receiving trading licenses, creating legal frameworks that transformed supernatural prejudice into official economic policy that excluded left-handed citizens from commercial participation. The marketplace architecture itself reveals how Roman commercial design had systematically eliminated left-handed trading opportunities. Stall arrangements forced customers to approach from angles that favored right-handed product handling. Weighing scales were positioned to accommodate right-handed operation exclusively. And coin exchange protocols required specific right-handed gestures that made left-handed transactions practically impossible. Roman markets had become physical manifestations of supernatural prejudice, transforming commercial spaces into environments where natural human variation was systematically excluded through practical design choices that reinforced theological prohibitions. You watch as Marcus attempts to serve a wealthy matron shopping for exotic spices, but she recoils in horror when she notices him reaching for cinnamon bark with his left hand, immediately demanding that he transfer the merchandise to his right hand before she'll consider completing the transaction. Roman customers had been trained to monitor merchant hand preferences as carefully as they evaluated product quality, creating commercial relationships where supernatural orthodoxy mattered more than actual goods or services being exchanged. The customer interaction reveals the complex protocols that governed left-handed commercial participation in Roman markets. Sinister merchants were required to announce their condition to potential customers, use only right-handed assistants for actual product handling, and charge reduced prices to compensate buyers for the spiritual risk they assumed by purchasing cursed merchandise. These regulations created economic systems where left-handed traders faced systematic discrimination that made profitable business operation nearly impossible. forcing many talented merchants out of commercial careers despite their expertise and entrepreneurial abilities. Marcus's business partner, a right-handed trader named Gaius, explains to curious customers how their partnership allows the stall to operate despite Marcus's sinister contamination. All actual product handling is performed by Gaius, while Marcus provides expertise in spice identification and price negotiation from a safe distance that prevents his left-handed curse from directly affecting merchandise or customers. Roman commercial culture had developed elaborate workaround systems that acknowledged left-handed people's potential economic value while maintaining supernatural protection protocols that reinforced their social exclusion. The morning trading session continues with Marcus relegated to advisory roles while Gaius handles all physical transactions, creating commercial dynamics where left-handed expertise could be utilized only through right-handed intermediaries who served as spiritual buffers protecting customers from sinister contamination. Roman markets often became theaters where complex supernatural protocols governed simple economic exchanges, transforming basic commercial activities into elaborate religious ceremonies designed to maintain spiritual purity while conducting necessary business. But here's where Roman commercial left-handed discrimination reveals its most economically destructive consequences. Many of Rome's most skilled artisans, traders, and merchants may have been systematically excluded from commercial success not because they lacked business acumen or product knowledge, but because their natural hand preference was considered spiritually dangerous. The empire may have significantly reduced its economic efficiency by eliminating talented commercial participants through supernatural prejudices that had no basis in actual trading competence or market performance. Historians still argue whether Roman commercial restrictions on left-handed traders originated from practical concerns about standardized business procedures and customer comfort, or purely supernatural fears about cursed merchandise contaminating market transactions. But surviving commercial regulations suggest that traders genuinely believed sinister merchants posed existential threats to economic prosperity. Some economic historians theorize that left-handedness commercial exclusion may have contributed to periodic market instabilities by reducing the diversity of trading perspectives and business innovations that could have strengthened Roman commercial networks. You notice how other merchants in the marketplace carefully monitor Marcus's activities, ready to report any violations of sinister trading protocols to market officials who possess authority to revoke licenses and ban left-handed traders from future commercial participation. Roman markets had become surveillance systems where supernatural orthodoxy was enforced through peer monitoring that prioritized theological compliance over economic effectiveness, creating commercial environments where fear of contamination took precedence over profitable trading relationships. The customer flow around Marcus's stall demonstrates how Roman commercial prejudices created self-reinforcing cycles of economic exclusion. Customers avoided left-handed merchants because they feared spiritual contamination. Reduced sales forced sinister traders to lower prices and accept inferior locations. Economic marginalization reinforced perceptions that left-handed people were inherently unsuccessful, and commercial failure was interpreted as evidence of divine disapproval rather than systematic discrimination. Roman markets had created feedback loops where supernatural prejudice generated economic evidence that supposedly justified continued persecution. A wealthy senator steward arrives to negotiate bulk spice purchases for an upcoming banquet, but immediately terminates discussions when he observes Marcus's left-handed gestures, explaining that serving food prepared with ingredients handled by sinister merchants could contaminate the entire feast and bring supernatural disaster upon his master's household. Roman commercial culture had extended left-handed fears into complex supply chains where contamination concerns affected multiple levels of economic activity, creating market inefficiencies that prioritized spiritual purity over commercial convenience or competitive pricing. Remember that classroom where Claudia faced educational brutality for her natural hand preference. The same systematic persecution now extends into Roman commerce, transforming markets from centers of economic opportunity into enforcement mechanisms for supernatural orthodoxy that damaged commercial efficiency in pursuit of spiritual conformity that had no basis in actual trading competence or business success. The trading day continues with Marcus struggling to maintain his business while navigating complex protocols designed to accommodate his sinister condition without completely excluding him from commercial participation, creating economic relationships where natural human variation was treated as spiritual disease requiring elaborate management systems rather than simple acceptance. Roman markets had transformed commerce from straightforward economic exchange into complicated theological performances where supernatural compliance often mattered more than product quality or competitive pricing. But the most economically devastating aspect of Roman commercial left-handed discrimination may be its impact on innovation and entrepreneurship. Many of Rome's potential business leaders, trading pioneers, and commercial innovators may have had their economic contributions eliminated through market systems that prioritized hand preference conformity over actual business ability. The empire may have systematically reduced its commercial potential through policies designed to maintain spiritual purity in economic environments. As evening approaches and Marcus packs his remaining unsold merchandise while calculating another day's reduced profits caused by supernatural discrimination rather than market competition, you realize that Roman commercial culture had created yet another institutional framework for persecuting left-handed citizens. This time targeting their economic survival and transforming markets from centers of opportunity into mechanisms for systematic exclusion that damaged both individual prosperity and imperial commercial efficiency. You leave that marketplace where Marcus struggles with commercial discrimination and find yourself transported to the steps of the Curia Julia, the Roman Senate House, where a promising young politician named Lucius Cornelius Maximus is about to discover that his left-handed gestures during a crucial speech will destroy his entire political career. As Roman governmental culture had developed elaborate supernatural protocols that systematically excluded sinister leaders from wielding the divine authority that legitimate political power required. The marble corridors echo with whispered conversations as senators notice Maximus unconsciously gesturing with his left hand while discussing grain distribution policies, their faces displaying the same horrified recognition that has marked left-handed people as spiritually unfit for leadership throughout Roman political history. Roman political superstitions operated on the fundamental belief that governmental authority derived directly from divine approval, and that left-handed leaders possessed an inherent inability to channel celestial power through sinister limbs that were spiritually aligned with dark forces opposing Roman imperial destiny. Constitutional traditions dating back to the early Republic included specific provisions requiring magistrates to demonstrate right-handed competency before assuming office, creating legal frameworks that transformed supernatural prejudice into official governmental policy that excluded left-handed citizens from political participation at every level of Roman administration. The Senate chamber architecture itself reveals how Roman political design had systematically eliminated left-handed leadership opportunities. Speaking platforms were positioned to favor right-handed oratory gestures, voting procedures required specific right-handed tablet handling, and ceremonial protocols demanded right-handed ritual performances that made left-handed political participation practically impossible. The Curia had become a physical manifestation of supernatural prejudice, transforming governmental spaces into environments where natural human variation was systematically excluded through practical design choices that reinforced theological prohibitions against sinister authority. You watch as Maximus continues his speech about provincial taxation reform, completely unaware that his natural left-handed emphasis gestures are being interpreted by senior senators as evidence of divine disapproval and spiritual unfitness for political leadership. Roman politicians had been trained to monitor each other's hand preferences as carefully as they evaluated policy positions, creating governmental relationships where supernatural orthodoxy mattered more than actual legislative competence or administrative ability. The political interaction reveals the complex protocols that governed left-handed participation in Roman government. Sinister politicians were required to undergo purification rituals before entering the Senate chamber, use only right-handed scribes for official correspondence, and demonstrate continuous right-handed compliance during public appearances to maintain their tenuous hold on political legitimacy. These regulations created governmental systems where left-handed leaders faced systematic scrutiny that made effective political operation nearly impossible, forcing many talented administrators out of public service despite their expertise and leadership abilities. A senior consul named Marcus Tullius Cicero the Younger, great-nephew of the famous orator, interrupts Maximus's speech to formally challenge his right to address the Senate, citing ancient precedents that prohibited sinister speakers from contaminating official governmental proceedings with left-handed gestures that could anger the gods and bring supernatural disaster upon Roman state interests. Roman political culture had developed elaborate challenge systems that allowed supernatural orthodoxy concerns to override democratic participation and legislative effectiveness. The Senate session continues with Maximus forced to defend not his policy proposals but his spiritual fitness for political participation, creating governmental dynamics where left-handed competence was considered irrelevant compared to hand preference conformity that supposedly determined divine approval for leadership authority. Roman politics often became theological tribunals where supernatural compliance was debated more intensively than actual governance issues affecting imperial prosperity and citizen welfare. But here's where Roman political left-handed discrimination reveals its most governmentally destructive consequences. Many of Rome's most capable administrators, military strategists, and legislative innovators may have been systematically excluded from political leadership not because they lacked governmental competence or public support, but because their natural hand preference was considered spiritually incompatible with divine authority. The empire may have significantly reduced its governmental effectiveness by eliminating talented political participants through supernatural prejudices that had no basis in actual leadership ability or administrative performance. The challenge process escalates as other senators join the debate about Maximus's spiritual fitness, with some arguing that his left-handed tendencies could contaminate upcoming religious ceremonies where the Senate traditionally participated in state cult rituals that required pure right-handed performance. Roman governmental culture had extended left-handed fears into complex constitutional procedures where contamination concerns affected multiple levels of political activity, creating administrative inefficiencies that prioritized spiritual purity over governmental functionality. Historians still argue whether Roman political restrictions on left-handed leaders originated from practical concerns about ceremonial uniformity and religious protocol compliance, or purely supernatural fears about cursed authority contaminating state power and divine relationships. But surviving constitutional texts suggest that politicians genuinely believed sinister leaders posed existential threats to imperial stability. Some political historians theorize that left-handedness governmental exclusion may have contributed to periodic administrative crises by reducing the diversity of leadership perspectives and policy innovations that could have strengthened Roman political institutions. You notice how junior senators carefully monitor their own hand positions during the debate, many of them unconsciously checking their gestures to ensure they're not accidentally displaying sinister tendencies that could mark them for similar political destruction. Roman government had become a surveillance system where supernatural orthodoxy was enforced through peer monitoring that prioritized theological compliance over effective governance, creating political environments where fear of contamination took precedence over legislative productivity and administrative competence. The political atmosphere in the chamber demonstrates how Roman governmental prejudices created self-reinforcing cycles of leadership exclusion. Voters avoided left-handed candidates because they feared divine retribution. Electoral marginalization forced sinister politicians to accept minor positions with limited authority. Political failure reinforced perceptions that left-handed people were inherently unfit for leadership, and governmental exclusion was interpreted as evidence of divine disapproval rather than systematic discrimination. Roman politics had created feedback loops where supernatural prejudice generated political evidence that supposedly justified continued persecution. A delegation of priests arrives to consult with the Senate about upcoming religious festivals, but they immediately express concern about proceeding with ceremonial planning while a left-handed politician remains in the chamber, explaining that sinister contamination could invalidate sacred rituals and anger gods whose favor was essential for Roman military success and agricultural prosperity. Roman political culture had integrated left-handed fears into complex governmental processes where spiritual concerns affected practical policy implementation and administrative effectiveness. Remember that marketplace where Marcus faced commercial persecution for his natural hand preference? The same systematic discrimination now extends into Roman government, transforming politics from public service into enforcement mechanisms for supernatural orthodoxy that damaged governmental efficiency in pursuit of spiritual conformity that had no basis in actual leadership competence or administrative success. The Senate session continues with Maximus's political career effectively destroyed by supernatural accusations rather than policy disagreements, creating governmental dynamics where natural human variation was treated as constitutional disqualification requiring systematic exclusion rather than simple accommodation. Roman politics had transformed governance from representative democracy into theological performance where supernatural compliance often mattered more than legislative effectiveness or public welfare. But the most politically devastating aspect of Roman governmental left-handed discrimination may be its impact on policy innovation and administrative reform. Many of Rome's potential constitutional reformers, military modernizers, and governmental innovators may have had their political contributions eliminated through systems that prioritized hand preference conformity over actual leadership ability. The empire may have systematically reduced its governmental potential through policies designed to maintain spiritual purity in political environments. As the Senate session concludes with Maximus stripped of his speaking privileges and facing probable expulsion from political life, you realize that Roman governmental culture had created yet another institutional framework for persecuting left-handed citizens. This time targeting their civic participation and transforming politics from democratic representation into mechanisms for systematic exclusion that damaged both individual opportunity and imperial administrative effectiveness. You leave that Senate chamber where Maximus's political career lies in ruins and find yourself transported to a Roman military camp along the Rhine frontier, where General Marcus Valerius Brutus is interrogating a captured Germanic warrior whose left-handed sword techniques have convinced Roman intelligence officers that barbarian tribes are systematically training sinister fighters as supernatural weapons designed to contaminate Roman military formations and channel dark magical forces against imperial legions. The torchlit interrogation tent crackles with tension as military scribes document what they believe to be evidence of foreign conspiracy involving left-handed combat methods that threaten not just Roman tactical superiority, but the spiritual foundations of imperial civilization itself. Roman xenophobic superstitions operated on the fundamental belief that foreign enemies possessed access to sinister magical traditions that civilized Romans had rightfully abandoned, and that barbarian left-handedness represented a deliberate cultivation of dark supernatural powers designed to corrupt Roman military virtue and undermine the divine favor that guaranteed imperial victory. Military intelligence reports from frontier commanders throughout Germania, Britannia, and Dacia included detailed observations about enemy left-handed fighting techniques, creating strategic assessments that interpreted natural human variation as evidence of coordinated magical warfare directed against Roman civilization. The military camp layout itself reveals how Roman frontier design had incorporated anti-left-handed defensive measures based on assumptions about barbarian supernatural capabilities. Fortification gates were positioned to favor right-handed defensive formations, weapon storage protocols prioritized right-handed access patterns, and combat training exercises systematically prepared legionnaires to counter left-handed attacks that were assumed to carry supernatural contamination. Roman military architecture had become a physical manifestation of xenophobic prejudice, transforming defensive installations into environments where fear of foreign sinister magic influenced practical strategic planning. You watch as the Germanic prisoner demonstrates his natural left-handed spear work, completely unaware that Roman observers are interpreting his movements as evidence of systematic magical training rather than simple combat preference. Roman military analysts had been taught to identify left-handed foreign techniques as indicators of supernatural threat level, creating intelligence systems where enemy hand preferences mattered more than actual tactical capabilities or strategic intentions. The interrogation reveals the complex theories that governed Roman interpretation of foreign left-handedness. Barbarian sinister fighters were believed to undergo ritual possession by dark spirits. Enemy tribes supposedly selected left-handed children for specialized magical warrior training. And foreign left-handed combat techniques were thought to channel supernatural forces that could corrupt Roman soldiers through direct contact. These beliefs created military doctrines where left-handed enemies were considered more dangerous than conventional fighters, requiring special tactical countermeasures and spiritual protection protocols. A Roman centurion named Gaius Flavius Maximus explains to visiting military inspectors how frontier legions had developed specialized anti-sinister combat techniques designed to neutralize barbarian left-handed magical advantages through superior right-handed discipline and divine protection rituals. Roman military culture had created elaborate tactical systems that acknowledged foreign left-handed effectiveness while maintaining that Roman spiritual superiority could overcome barbarian supernatural contamination through proper religious preparation and tactical orthodoxy. The military briefing continues with intelligence officers presenting captured weapons and armor that allegedly demonstrate barbarian left-handed magical enhancement, creating strategic discussions where supernatural speculation influenced practical military planning and resource allocation. Roman frontier commands often became centers where xenophobic fears about foreign magic were transformed into official military doctrine that affected troop deployment, tactical training, and strategic decision-making processes. But here's where Roman military left-handed xenophobia reveals its most strategically destructive consequences. Many Roman tactical innovations and combat improvements may have been rejected not because they lacked military effectiveness, but because they resembled foreign left-handed techniques that were considered spiritually contaminating. The empire may have significantly reduced its military adaptability by refusing to learn from enemy innovations through xenophobic prejudices that prioritized supernatural purity over tactical effectiveness. The interrogation continues with Roman officers attempting to extract information about barbarian left-handed training methods and magical rituals, convinced that understanding enemy sinister techniques could provide intelligence advantages for future military campaigns. Roman military intelligence had developed systematic protocols for investigating foreign left-handedness as a form of supernatural warfare, creating espionage systems where hand preference analysis was considered as important as conventional strategic reconnaissance. Historians still argue whether Roman military fears about barbarian left-handedness originated from practical observations about enemy tactical effectiveness and unfamiliar combat techniques, or purely xenophobic assumptions about foreign magical capabilities and supernatural contamination threats. But surviving military correspondence suggests that commanders genuinely believed enemy sinister fighters posed existential threats to Roman strategic superiority. Some military historians theorize that left-handedness xenophobia may have contributed to occasional tactical surprises by preventing Roman adaptation to effective enemy innovations that were dismissed as supernatural contamination rather than legitimate military developments. You notice how Roman soldiers in the camp carefully monitor each other for any left-handed tendencies that might indicate foreign magical influence or barbarian contamination, creating military environments where supernatural surveillance was considered as important as conventional security measures. Roman frontier forces had become monitoring systems where xenophobic orthodoxy was enforced through peer observation that prioritized spiritual purity over military effectiveness, transforming combat units into theological enforcement mechanisms. The military atmosphere demonstrates how Roman xenophobic prejudices created self-reinforcing cycles of strategic paranoia. Foreign left-handed effectiveness was interpreted as evidence of magical advantage. Tactical failures against barbarian enemies were blamed on supernatural contamination rather than strategic mistakes. Military defeats reinforced beliefs about enemies' sinister powers, and strategic limitations were attributed to foreign magical superiority rather than Roman tactical deficiencies. Roman military culture had created feedback loops where xenophobic prejudice generated strategic explanations that supposedly justified continued fear of foreign left-handed capabilities. A delegation of Gallic auxiliary troops arrives for military consultation, but Roman officers immediately express suspicion about their loyalty and reliability after observing several left-handed fighters among their ranks, explaining that barbarian sinister contamination could spread through military units and compromise Roman tactical integrity. Roman military culture had extended left-handed fears into complex alliance relationships where supernatural concerns affected diplomatic cooperation and strategic partnership effectiveness. The prisoner exchange negotiations reveal how Roman military xenophobia had created diplomatic complications where hand preference observations influenced international relations and strategic alliance building. foreign diplomats and military representatives were systematically evaluated for left-handed tendencies that were interpreted as indicators of magical threat level and supernatural reliability, creating international relationships where natural human variation affected political cooperation and military partnership potential. Remember that Senate chamber where political careers were destroyed by supernatural accusations. The same systematic persecution now extends into Roman military xenophobia, transforming frontier defense from strategic protection into enforcement mechanisms for cultural orthodoxy that damaged military effectiveness in pursuit of spiritual conformity that had no basis in actual tactical competence or strategic success. The military briefing concludes with intelligence officers recommending increased surveillance of Allied barbarian units for left-handed contamination while developing enhanced counter-sinister combat techniques, creating military policies where xenophobic superstition influenced practical strategic planning and tactical development. Roman frontier commands had transformed military service from professional warfare into theological performance where supernatural compliance often mattered more than combat effectiveness or strategic objectives. But the most strategically devastating aspect of Roman military left-handed xenophobia may be its impact on tactical innovation and strategic adaptation. Many of Rome's potential military reforms, combat improvements, and strategic innovations may have been systematically rejected through policies that prioritized cultural purity over battlefield effectiveness. The empire may have reduced its military potential by refusing to learn from foreign tactical developments that could have strengthened Roman strategic capabilities. As dawn breaks over the Rhine frontier where Roman paranoia about barbarian left-handed magic continues to influence military planning and strategic decision-making, you realize that Roman xenophobic culture had created yet another institutional framework for persecuting natural human variation. This time extending that persecution to foreign enemies and transforming military intelligence from strategic analysis into supernatural speculation that damaged both tactical effectiveness and diplomatic cooperation. You leave that Rhine frontier where military paranoia about barbarian left-handed magic influences strategic planning and find yourself transported to the philosophical gardens of the Lyceum in Rome, where the great Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius Severus is engaged in heated intellectual debate with his Epicurean rival Gaius Lucretius Maximus about whether left-handedness represents a natural variation in human development, or evidence of demonic possession that requires immediate spiritual intervention. The marble columns echo with passionate argumentation as Rome's greatest thinkers grapple with fundamental questions about human nature, divine will, and the metaphysical significance of sinister limb preference that has divided philosophical schools into warring camps of intellectual opinion. Roman philosophical traditions operated on competing theoretical frameworks that interpreted left-handedness through radically different metaphysical lenses. Stoics generally argued that sinister hand preference represented cosmic disorder requiring rational correction through disciplined training, while Epicureans suggested that left-handedness might be natural variation that deserved acceptance rather than persecution, and Platonists maintained that sinister tendencies reflected imperfect soul development that could be corrected through proper philosophical education. These philosophical divisions created intellectual environments where abstract theoretical debates had immediate practical consequences for how Roman society treated left-handed citizens. The philosophical garden architecture itself reveals how Roman intellectual spaces had been designed to accommodate right-handed scholarly activities. Writing surfaces were positioned for right-handed note-taking, scrolls were stored in configurations that favored right-handed retrieval, and lecture platforms were arranged to facilitate right-handed gestures during philosophical demonstrations. The Lyceum had become a physical manifestation of intellectual prejudice, transforming educational environments into spaces where natural human variation was systematically excluded through practical design choices that reinforced philosophical orthodoxy. You watch as Marcus Aurelius presents his Stoic argument that left-handedness represents a failure of rational self-control that virtuous individuals must overcome through disciplined mental training, while Gaius Lucretius counters with Epicurean claims that sinister hand preference might be natural atomic arrangement that requires acceptance rather than correction. Roman philosophers had transformed personal hand preference into cosmic battleground where fundamental questions about human nature, free will, and divine providence were debated with intellectual intensity that matched discussions about ethics, logic, and metaphysics. The philosophical debate reveals the complex theoretical frameworks that governed Roman intellectual interpretation of left-handedness. Stoic philosophers developed elaborate training regimens designed to help left-handed students achieve right-handed rational control. Epicurean thinkers created acceptance philosophies that challenged supernatural persecution of natural variation. And Platonic academicians proposed educational programs that could supposedly correct sinister soul defects through proper intellectual development. These competing approaches created philosophical schools where left-handedness became a test case for broader questions about human improvement, natural law, and cosmic order. A young philosophy student named Quintus Fabius Maximus raises his left hand to ask a question during the debate, immediately triggering a secondary philosophical discussion about whether his sinister gesture invalidates his participation in rational discourse, or simply demonstrates the natural diversity that Epicurean philosophy celebrates. Roman intellectual culture had developed protocols where hand preference observations influenced scholarly evaluation and academic participation, creating educational environments where supernatural orthodoxy competed with philosophical inquiry for dominance in learning processes. The academic session continues with other philosophers joining the debate about left-handedness' metaphysical significance, transforming what began as abstract theoretical discussion into practical examination of Roman social policies and their philosophical justifications. Roman philosophical schools often became testing grounds where intellectual theories were evaluated against real-world applications, creating scholarly environments where abstract ideas had immediate consequences for how society treated individual citizens. But here's where Roman philosophical left-handed debates revealed their most intellectually destructive consequences. Many potential philosophical innovations and theoretical developments may have been systematically rejected not because they lacked logical validity or explanatory power, but because they challenged supernatural prejudices that were considered foundational to Roman cultural identity. The empire may have significantly reduced its intellectual progress by limiting philosophical inquiry through theological constraints that prioritized religious orthodoxy over rational investigation. The debate escalates as representatives from other philosophical schools arrive to present alternative theoretical frameworks. Aristotelian peripatetics argue that left-handedness represents biological accident requiring practical accommodation, while Cynic philosophers suggest that sinister persecution demonstrates Roman society's corruption and departure from natural virtue. Roman intellectual culture had created competitive environments where left-handedness became a philosophical proving ground for testing theoretical consistency and practical application of abstract principles. Historians still argue whether Roman philosophical debates about left-handedness originated from genuine intellectual curiosity about human nature and cosmic order, or served primarily as intellectual exercises that allowed philosophers to demonstrate theoretical sophistication while avoiding direct challenges to social orthodoxy. But surviving philosophical texts suggest that thinkers genuinely believed sinister hand preference raised fundamental questions about human development and divine providence. Some intellectual historians theorize that left-handedness philosophical debates may have contributed to important theoretical developments by forcing Roman thinkers to examine assumptions about natural law, human variation, and social justice. You notice how philosophy students carefully position themselves during the debate to avoid displaying left-handed gestures that might influence how their intellectual contributions are evaluated, creating academic environments where supernatural concerns affected scholarly participation and theoretical development. Roman philosophical schools had become surveillance systems where intellectual orthodoxy was enforced through peer monitoring that prioritized theological compliance over logical reasoning, transforming learning spaces into ideological enforcement mechanisms. The philosophical atmosphere demonstrates how Roman intellectual prejudices created self-reinforcing cycles of theoretical limitation. Left-handed persecution was justified through philosophical arguments that assumed sinister contamination. Intellectual theories that challenged supernatural orthodoxy were rejected as spiritually dangerous. Philosophical failure to resolve left-handedness questions was interpreted as evidence of cosmic complexity rather than theoretical inadequacy, and academic exclusion was attributed to divine wisdom rather than systematic intellectual prejudice. Roman philosophy had created feedback loops where supernatural assumptions generated theoretical explanations that supposedly justified continued persecution of natural variation. A delegation of Egyptian philosophers arrives to present alternative cultural perspectives on left-handedness, but Roman intellectuals immediately dismissed their contributions as foreign contamination that could corrupt pure Roman philosophical traditions with barbarian magical thinking. Roman intellectual culture had extended xenophobic fears into academic environments where foreign theoretical contributions were systematically excluded through assumptions about cultural superiority and spiritual purity. The Philosophical Symposium reveals how Roman intellectual xenophobia had created academic limitations where hand preference theories from other cultures were rejected not based on logical evaluation but through cultural prejudices that assumed Roman philosophical superiority. Foreign scholars and theoretical frameworks were systematically evaluated for supernatural contamination that was thought to threaten Roman intellectual purity, creating academic relationships where cultural orthodoxy affected theoretical cooperation and scholarly exchange. Remember that military frontier where xenophobic paranoia about barbarian left-handed magic influenced strategic planning? The same systematic prejudice now extends into Roman philosophy, transforming intellectual inquiry from rational investigation into enforcement mechanisms for cultural orthodoxy that damaged philosophical development in pursuit of spiritual conformity that had no basis in actual logical reasoning or theoretical effectiveness. The philosophical debate concludes with competing schools agreeing to continue their theoretical investigations while maintaining practical support for existing social policies that systematically persecute left-handed citizens, creating intellectual frameworks where abstract philosophical sophistication coexisted with concrete social brutality. Roman philosophical culture had transformed academic inquiry from pure rational investigation into theological performance where intellectual compliance often mattered more than logical consistency or theoretical innovation. But the most intellectually devastating aspect of Roman philosophical left-handed debates may be their impact on theoretical development and rational progress. Many of Rome's potential philosophical breakthroughs, logical innovations, and ethical advances may have been systematically prevented through academic systems that prioritized supernatural orthodoxy over intellectual honesty. The empire may have reduced its philosophical potential by limiting rational inquiry through theological constraints that damaged both theoretical development and practical social improvement. As evening settles over the philosophical gardens where abstract debates about left-handedness continue while concrete persecution destroys individual lives throughout Roman society, you realize that Roman intellectual culture had created yet another institutional framework for justifying systematic discrimination. This time transforming philosophy from rational inquiry into sophisticated rationalization for supernatural prejudice that damaged both intellectual progress and social justice. You leave those philosophical gardens where abstract debates rationalize concrete persecution and find yourself transported forward through time to the court of Emperor Constantine in 325 C, where the newly Christianized Roman Empire is systematically transforming pagan left-handed superstitions into biblical condemnations that will echo through medieval Europe for the next 1,000 years. As Christian theologians discover that Roman sinister fears align perfectly with scriptural references to God's right hand and Satan's left-sided domain, the marble halls of the Lateran Palace buzz with theological discussions as bishops and imperial advisors craft religious policies that will transform Roman left-handed persecution from supernatural prejudice into divine commandment, creating institutional frameworks for discrimination that will survive the empire's political collapse and flourish throughout medieval Christendom. The Christianization of Roman left-handed fears operated through systematic theological reinterpretation that preserved existing social prejudices while providing new religious justifications rooted in biblical authority rather than pagan superstition. Early Christian writers like Jerome and Augustine incorporated Roman sinister terminology into scriptural commentary that identified left-handedness with spiritual corruption, demonic influence, and divine rejection, creating theological frameworks that transformed cultural prejudice into religious doctrine that claimed eternal rather than temporal authority over human hand preference. You witness how Christian architectural design had absorbed Roman anti-left-handed spatial principles while adding new religious symbolism that reinforced sinister condemnation, Church layouts positioned altars and pulpits to favor right-handed ceremonial gestures. Baptismal fonts were designed for right-handed priestly administration. And ecclesiastical art systematically depicted divine figures with right-handed blessing poses, while relegating left-handed imagery to demonic representations. Medieval churches became physical manifestations of theological prejudice that combined Roman spatial discrimination with Christian symbolic condemnation. The theological transformation reveals how Roman left-handed persecution had evolved from pragmatic superstition into systematic religious doctrine that claimed biblical foundation for existing social practices. Christian scholars developed elaborate scriptural interpretations that identified Jesus' position at God's right hand as cosmic condemnation of left-handedness, while Satan's traditional left-sided domain provided theological justification for treating sinister people as spiritually corrupted souls requiring aggressive correction or permanent exclusion from Christian community. But here's where the medieval transformation of Roman left-handed fears reveals its most historically significant consequences: the systematic preservation and amplification of ancient prejudices through religious institutionalization that would influence European culture for centuries beyond the Roman Empire's collapse. Medieval Christianity had created theological frameworks that transformed temporary cultural superstitions into permanent religious doctrines that claimed divine rather than human authority, making left-handed persecution seem like cosmic justice rather than social discrimination. You observe how medieval monasteries had developed elaborate protocols for identifying and correcting left-handed novices that combined Roman educational brutality with Christian spiritual discipline. Sinister monks faced systematic isolation, aggressive prayer regimens designed to overcome demonic influence, and physical correction programs that claimed to restore divine favor through forced right-handed compliance. Medieval religious communities had become training grounds where Roman persecution techniques were refined through Christian theological justification. The monastic atmosphere demonstrates how Roman left-handed discrimination had been systematically preserved through religious institutionalization that provided supernatural authority for continuing ancient prejudices. Medieval Christianity had created educational and spiritual frameworks that maintained Roman persecution, while adding new layers of theological condemnation that made left-handedness seem like spiritual disease requiring aggressive religious intervention rather than simple cultural accommodation. Historians still argue whether medieval Christian left-handed persecution represented genuine theological development based on scriptural interpretation, or simply provided convenient religious justification for preserving existing Roman cultural prejudices that served political and social control functions. But surviving ecclesiastical documents suggest that medieval religious authorities genuinely believed left-handedness posed spiritual threats to Christian community integrity. Some religious historians theorize that Christian preservation of Roman sinister fears may have significantly influenced European cultural development by maintaining systematic persecution frameworks that affected everything from education and law to art and literature. The theological discussions in Constantine's court reveal how Roman left-handed superstitions were being systematically integrated into Christian doctrine through biblical interpretation that claimed scriptural authority for existing social practices. Early Christian theologians had discovered that Roman sinister terminology aligned perfectly with biblical imagery about divine favor and demonic corruption, creating religious synthesis that preserved ancient prejudices while providing new theological justification for systematic persecution. You notice how Christian conversion had not eliminated Roman left-handed fears but rather provided them with enhanced religious authority that made persecution seem divinely mandated rather than culturally constructed. Medieval Christianity had created theological systems where ancient superstitions became religious doctrines that claimed eternal validity rather than temporal convenience, transforming social prejudice into spiritual obligation that would influence European culture for centuries. The imperial court atmosphere demonstrates how political and religious authorities had collaborated to preserve Roman left-handed persecution through Christian institutionalization that provided enhanced legitimacy for existing discrimination. Medieval political systems had discovered that religious justification for social prejudices created more stable control mechanisms than purely secular authority, transforming ancient superstitions into divine commandments that were more difficult to challenge or reform. The medieval transformation process reveals how Roman left-handed persecution had achieved historical permanence through religious institutionalization that preserved ancient prejudices while adapting them to new theological contexts. Christian authorities had successfully transformed temporary cultural superstitions into permanent religious doctrines that would influence European education, law, medicine, and social organization for centuries beyond the Roman Empire's political collapse. A procession of medieval bishops arrives to discuss ecclesiastical policies regarding left-handed clergy and religious education, demonstrating how Christian religious hierarchy had systematically adopted Roman persecution frameworks while enhancing them through biblical authority and theological sophistication. Medieval Christianity had created institutional mechanisms for preserving ancient prejudices that were more comprehensive and durable than their Roman predecessors. Remember those philosophical gardens where intellectual debates justified systematic persecution? The same rationalization process now extends into medieval Christianity, transforming religious doctrine from spiritual guidance into enforcement mechanisms for cultural orthodoxy that would damage European social development for centuries while claiming divine rather than human authority for systematic discrimination against natural human variation. The theological synthesis continues with Christian scholars developing comprehensive doctrinal frameworks that combine Roman sinister superstitions with biblical condemnations, creating religious systems where left-handedness becomes evidence of spiritual corruption requiring aggressive correction through prayer, penance, and physical discipline. Medieval Christianity had transformed ancient cultural prejudices into divine commandments that would influence European civilization throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. But the most historically devastating aspect of medieval Christian preservation of Roman left-handed fears may be its long-term cultural impact on European development. Centuries of systematic persecution based on religious rather than cultural authority, educational systems that brutalized children in God's name rather than emperor's orders, and social frameworks that treated natural human variation as spiritual disease requiring divine intervention rather than human accommodation. As you witness the theological transformation that will preserve Roman left-handed persecution through medieval European Christianity and influence Western culture for the next millennium, the gentle evening light begins to fade, and you feel yourself slowly drifting away from these ancient halls where human prejudice was being transformed into divine commandment, carrying forward the echoes of persecution that would whisper through centuries of European history, affecting countless lives. Through religious authority that claimed eternal rather than temporal justification for systematic discrimination against the simple, natural, beautiful diversity of human hand preference. The marble corridors grow dim and quiet as theological discussions continue into the night, where bishops and scholars craft religious policies that will echo through medieval cathedrals and monastery schools, university lecture halls and royal courts, creating institutional frameworks for persecution that will outlast empires and kingdoms. Surviving through religious authority that transforms ancient superstitions into sacred doctrine, preserving Roman fears through Christian faith, and ensuring that left-handed persecution will continue long after the empire that created it has crumbled into historical memory. You feel the weight of centuries settling softly around you as the voices of theological debate fade into gentle whispers, and the ancient fears that began with Roman superstition transform into medieval religious doctrine that will influence European culture for generations yet to come, carrying forward the systematic persecution of natural human variation through institutional frameworks that claim divine rather than human authority, preserving ancient prejudices through religious conviction, that will echo through the corridors of European history for centuries beyond the Roman Empire's final collapse.